It is ban list announcement time, March 11th, 2024. Banned and restricted announcement. I didn't do a live reaction. This is a little bit later. I saw the announcement a little bit earlier, so you're not going to get my initial first reaction, but pretty close. So as you can see here, the changes, announcement date March 11th, Modern Violent Outburst has been banned. This little guy right here, I could only find two of them because I threw my other ones, but no mas. Everybody say goodbye to the one, the only. I have two more somewhere, but they're I don't know. I threw them, so. But Violent Outburst has officially been banned from the Modern format. It was something that people on Twitter were discussing over the past couple of days, past couple of weeks, and for what it is, we'll get into it a little bit more. But just kind of a baseline initial first take. I think it probably is a good change for the format, but I think we need a little bit more, and we'll kind of get into that as we move through the ban list discussions. We're going to kind of go format by format. Standard, I think this is kind of the easiest one to start with. I don't think anybody in the world thinks that anything should happen to standard, or standard is the best format right now. So just in terms of play patterns, win rates, metagame representation, just the overall format in a general sense, I think standard is the best that it's ever been. Maybe there's there might be one card banned that I've heard some people discuss over, past couple of weeks, especially with the introduction of Boros Convoke, and that is Meathook Massacre. Now, I'm not going to say that you should unban Meathook Massacre, but I don't really understand why it was banned in the first place, so maybe that is something to keep in mind moving along if Boros Convoke ever gets a little bit too, if Boros Convoke ever gets to a certain point where the metagame share is a little bit too high, maybe the win rate's too high, you could maybe look at unbanning Meathook Massacre, but for now, I think it's totally fine. Like I said, Standard is just in an amazing spot right now. I don't think I would change anything. It is the best format, whether you want to believe it or not. And Standard's perfect. I mean, they talked about the 75k Open, that CFT SOC won, with that 68 card Slogurk Analyst Nissa deck, which was amazing. We've seen Randomator decks, combo decks, aggro decks, control decks, mid-range decks. I guess the one complaint that a lot of people share is Shieldred, or maybe just the mid-range core in a general sense that maybe is a little bit too pushed. But, if you look at the number of Shieldreds that are in the average mid-range deck over the past couple of weeks of results, they're not even playing that many copies, because more people are playing more copies of Go for the Throat, and Shieldred not as good against the 4 Go for the Throat setup, so that's something that you want to keep in mind as well. So I think Standard's perfect, would not change anything. That's all I really have to say about Standard. I've been playing a lot of it, love the format. Moving on to Pioneer, so this is a bit of a short section on Pioneer. So they first alluded to the changes that they made during their previous announcement, which I have right here. This was when they banned Karn, Geological Appraiser, and unbanned Smuggler's Copter. So just kind of for reference there. And that was the changes that they made. Now, to be honest with you, Pioneer before those bans was kind of a shit show. It was a dumpster fire, basically. You had the printing of Geological Appraiser, which just ruined the entire format. There were all these Cascade decks that were trying to kill you on turn 3, and that gameplay sucked. Karn the Great Creator, a lot of people maybe didn't necessarily think that card should have been banned, but Mono Green Devotion, even though I would say that Mono Green Devotion at the time wasn't necessarily a problem, it's one of those things similar to a card that we might be discussing. It's one of those things that eventually will be a problem, right? The more green cards they print, the more pips on green cards they print. You're eventually going to get to this critical mass. And Karn was just the design of card in general, allowing you to access sideboard cards in game 1, providing this really consistent combo finish that the deck, it just kind of did everything for the deck, right? So those are the changes they made for the previous announcement leading up to the Pro Tour. And then the Pioneer Pro Tour happened. And, as they mentioned here, we saw this deck win the entire event with Vein Ripper and Sorin. That was kind of coming out of left field. That was really cool. Awesome new deck. They talked about, as you can see here, they talk about how a lot of the new cards have made a very significant impact on the format, like No More Lies, bumping up blue-eye control, Amalia creating its own archetype in and of itself, which is kind of cool. Maybe the gameplay with Amalia is not the best, but it did create its brand new archetype. Then you have stuff like Picklock Prankster and Sleight of Hand, adding a bump to Phoenix, Archdruid's Charm, adding a bump to Lotus Field. So it kind of seems like all of these decks got a ton of, like, they really got a ton of new tools. And, from what you would seem, as far as reading this article is concerned, you would think that the format is relatively stable. But I would like to point you to a specific data point here. So this is the one, the only Frank Karsten posted this little matrix here for win rates from the Pioneer Pro Tour. Now, what we want to pay attention to is the decks that are highly represented, because, you see Dimir Control, only one person played it. Boros Burn, only one person played it. We can't really go off of data like that, right? But it just so happens that the most played deck in the entire room, which was Izzet Phoenix, I believe it was 18% metagame share, had one of the highest win rates at 57.5%, which is strange because typically when you have like the deck that is the most represented in the entire room, usually there's a bit of variance in terms of matchups, right? Where like some people do poorly, some people do well, yada yada. But even though Phoenix was the highest represented deck in the room, it still had a 57.5% win rate, which under normal circumstances is incredible. Anytime you can get that much above 50%, especially with that metagame share, is outrageously good. So I really do think that we're going to get to a point, if we aren't already are, I think we are going to get to a point where we have to have a discussion about banning Treasure Cruise. Now, as far as where I'm at on that personally, I haven't played a ton of Pioneer over the past couple of, months, really since Atlanta. But that is, again, fairly alarming, right? If you look at the highest played deck being that good, like that high of a win rate, it's a little scary. So, and Treasure Cruise is, one of those cards that they've cited in the past that they want to try and kind of warp the ban list around it, where they're banning the fetch lands, and that's why Cruise is allowed to exist. But I think we've kind of reached a point where there's a critical mass of cantrips, and once you kind of reach that critical mass of 1-mana cantrips, even though you don't have access to fetch lands, it's still trivially easy to put cards into your graveyard. And, if Treasure Cruise is that consistently a 1-mana draw 3, I think that's kind of, I think that's not necessarily where you want the format to be. So personally, I would have preferred to see a Cruise ban. Now, the other side of that, like the argument to that point, is Phoenix is a relatively decent best deck in the format, right? You don't want Lotus Field to be the best deck. The play pattern sucks. You don't want aggressive decks to be the best deck because you're dying way too quickly. So Phoenix kind of has this, I'm trying to think of the best way to put this. It's like the best mix of kind of aggressiveness, but also kind of can play a much longer mid-range game and kind of keep up with the other mid-range and control decks. So I'm not saying that Phoenix is a bad deck to be the best deck in the format, but I do think that with Cruise, it just feels like it's a little bit too much for me. Would Phoenix be unplayable without Cruise? I don't think so. I think you could potentially build a Phoenix deck without Cruise, but I would like to see how it plays out without Cruise. So, with the RCQ season coming up, I would have liked to see a Cruise ban, but again, it's a fine best deck to have. And then we get to the elephant in the room, or the rhino in the room, rather, or the lack thereof, the rhino in the room. And that is Violent Outburst being banned in Modern. So they talked about, again, the previous update. They removed Fury and Beanstalk. Now, I think a lot of people, when they removed Fury and Beanstalk, it was at a time where Rakdos Scam was far and away the best deck in the format, right? So I think a lot of people kind of... I don't know if it necessarily a lot of people kind of assumed that Grief was going to get banned, but that was I think a lot of people did kind of think that. That was the consensus on Twitter at that time, that they thought they were going to ban Grief. And it turns out that they didn't, right? They decided to remove Fury. Now, as far as the removal of Fury, I think that it was kind of good. The weird part about removing Fury is one of Scam's best counterplays to the Rhino strategy was Fury evoke, kill 2 Rhinos. So without Fury, you're actually making Rhinos better, right? As weird as that sounds, even though Fury was in the Rhinos decks, it wasn't a 4 of in any of the Rhinos decks at that time, if I recall correctly. So you're kind of removing the best thing against Rhinos and just initially making Rhinos a lot better. Now, as far as what the removal of Violent Outburst does to the format, so I want to take a look at the metagame snapshot real quick. So you see Footfalls here, 16.7% of the format, kind of a lot. Living End, personally, now I don't know if this is crazy to say. I don't think Living End is remotely playable without Violent Outburst. Part of the reason, and part of what makes Living End so good, is the threat of wrathing your opponent on their turn in their combat phase, right? Like haste creatures, creature lands, all that kind of stuff. And when you don't have the ability to wrath on their turn, I think that maybe it's not unplayable, but I do really, really think that playing at sorcery speed with Living End is much, much weaker than playing at sorcery speed with Footfalls. So I do think Living End is going to be mostly extinct. But then we go to the next two, which is Yawgmoth and Amulet Titan. Now, these, I think, are 2 decks that are naturally weak to Cascade. Yawgmoth, not as much against Living End, but Yawgmoth definitely gets crushed by Footfalls, and Amulet, I think, was bad against both Cascade decks. So if you kind of maybe can envision a downtick in Cascade, that would be a pretty big upgrade to Yawgmoth and Amulet Titan. Domain Zoo doesn't really care, just doing its thing. Now, as far as the rest of the format, I guess we should maybe touch on just Crashing Footfalls to start with. I'm going to be honest with you, I don't really think that the Violent Outburst ban is really going to affect Footfalls that much at all, right? We already have Ardent Play. The Crashing Footfalls decks kind of want to be 4 colors anyways to be able to support Leyline Binding, Scion, and Guild Pact. So it seems pretty trivial for them to just cut Violent Outburst and add Ardent Play, which maybe even opens up some deck building space to, like, maybe you want to play Solitude, because now you have Ardent Play and Leyline of the Guild Pact to pitch to Solitude. Now, granted, you don't have the Outburst and Force Negation on their turn, which does make the deck a lot weaker to counter spells. But to be honest with you, the cards that people are sideboarding against Crashing Footfalls weren't counter spells anyways, right? They were sideboarding Chalice, Draenith Magistrate, Soulless Jailer, Engineered Explosives. Like, they're not boarding in counter spells. Now, granted, some of those cards can get Force Negation, but I don't really think that the removal of Outburst necessarily changes the dynamic in terms of the cards that people are sideboarding in. Flusterstorm, yes, but Force Negation, guess what? Not good against Flusterstorm. So that's not even a valid point, you know? All of the cards that people are sideboarding in were not really, like, you're not Outburst plus Force on their turn to fight over their sideboard card. You know what I mean? Yes, sure, there are exceptions. Chalice is one of them, and but what I'm saying is you're not going to cut Force of Negation from your deck. You're still keeping in Force of Negation for their Chalices, for their Explosives, for their, Void Mirrors or whatever, right? But I think what the banning of Outburst will do is make more people want to play stuff like Spell Pierce, Stubborn Denial, those kind of 1-mana counter spells. And people were already playing Flusterstorm, sure, but you know what I mean? That's kind of where I'm at. But yeah, I really don't think much is going to change that. Much is going to change with Footfalls, with the exception of, adding Ardent Plea and potentially meaning you can play Solitude. But what it kind of does for the rest of the format is, now, I personally think that you should still play Force Negation in Crashing Footfalls. There's so many non-creature spells that people play. Like, you think Yawgmoth has Court of Calling, right? Amulet has Summoner's Pact in the One Ring. Domain Zoo, a little bit less good against them. They have Tribal Flames. Murktide has Expressive Iteration. Sometimes you want to be able to, against Scam, force their Not Dead After All. Tron has Karn. Omnath has Ring. You want to force Gorios. Colossus Hammer, Burn Spells, Creativity, Harden Scales. So, almost every single one of these decks still has a card that you want to force. And I really do think that you should still be playing Force in your decks. And because of that, I don't actually think that Tron gets much better. Tron's still going to be bad against Rhinos, but they just, still just go Shardless, force your play that you play on your turn, right? Whatever like that. Yogg will stop playing Chalice. I don't necessarily agree with that. Why would Yawgmoth want to stop playing Chalice? Another 4 years of Pioneer Rectus Phoenix Lotus. Perhaps. But yeah, I don't know. In closing, I think that I don't think Rhinos is going to change a ton. Living End dies. Yawgmoth and Amulet get bumped up a little bit. Domain Zoo probably stays the same. I don't know. How was the Domain Zoo versus Rhinos matchup? Murktide probably stays the same. Rakdos Scam, same. Tron, probably the same. I don't really see a lot of these other decks necessarily getting much worse or much better because of the removal of Violent Outburst. I guess Blue Eye Control. The one thing I will note is without Violent Outburst, Rhinos is much weaker to Supreme Verdict. So if Blue Eye Control goes and plays a bunch of Supreme Verdicts, right, yeah, then that makes them much better against Rhinos. So. In Pioneer, how do you feel about Phoenix versus Vampires Goes as a matchup? I could not tell you. I don't know. I don't know what the matchup looks like. But for the folks watching this on YouTube, just in closing, we're not going to talk about the other formats. I don't really know a ton about Legacy Vintage, although apparently Ponder got unbanned, so that's, if you're a Vintage fan, that's probably good for you. But yeah, I don't think a ton's really going to change in Modern. There's like maybe one or two decks that might get a little bit better, but yeah, I think, I do like that you don't have the option. Like, I think Spike made a great point on his stream today where it's kind of like the Splinter Twin thing, where in your Teamer Rhinos deck, if you hold up 3 mana, that could mean your, Violent Outburst for Rhinos, but it could also mean a plethora of other things. Hardcast, Force Negation, Dispute, Flame of Venor, Fire Ice, Dead Gone. So, and you can't play around all of that stuff. So I kind of do like the removal of Outburst, but I still don't think that it changes a ton about the metagame. But let me know what your thoughts in the comment section down below. Hope you enjoyed the video. And as always, thanks again for watching. We'll see you in the next one. Bye, YouTube. Everybody say, bye, YouTube. Also, 07's for Outburst.